A military general walks into a meeting he believes will be routine. He has done this dozens of times, crossed borders, shaken hands with leaders, collected envelopes, returned home. He has survived 4 governments, 3 coups, and 2 decades of institutional rot by knowing exactly how to play the game. He is untouchable. He has always been untouchable. But this time, the man sitting across the table is Ibrahim Traoré. And Traoré already knows everything. The question is not whether the general will be exposed. That decision was already made before he boarded the plane. The real question, the one that will echo across West Africa for years, is what Traoré chooses to do next. Because what he does in that room does not just end one man's career. It tears open 30 years of hidden crimes that powerful people on 3 continents spent billions trying to keep buried. To understand why this moment happens, you have to understand who this general is and why his name was never supposed to surface in public. Uganda's military had long projected an image of regional stability and professional discipline. Internationally, it was praised. Domestically, it was feared, and within that institution, certain figures had carved out personal empires so deeply embedded in the system that removing them seemed structurally impossible. They were not just corrupt, they were load-bearing corruption, the kind that entire networks of contracts, alliances, and silent partnerships depended on to keep functioning. This general was one of those figures. Yet he had spent decades positioning himself at the intersection of military logistics, resource extraction, and cross-border political brokerage. When a government needed weapons moved quietly, he made the arrangements. When a mining concession needed protecting without official paperwork, his men provided the security. When a foreign interest needed local cover to operate in restricted zones, he provided the face and the signature. In return, he accumulated wealth that never appeared in any declaration, loyalty that never appeared in any report, and influence that never appeared in any chain of command. He operated in the gaps between institutions, the places where accountability goes to disappear. And for a long time, that strategy was perfect, because the leaders he served were either complicit, compromised, or simply did not have the courage to look directly at what was happening beneath them. It is easy to manage a corrupt subordinate when the system rewards silence and punishes exposure. It is easy to keep secrets when the people who could reveal them are afraid of what happens next. But then came Traoré. Ibrahim Traoré came to power in Burkina Faso in September 2022 at 34 years old, the youngest head of state in the world at the time. He did not come through elections or inheritance or patient bureaucratic climbing. He came through rupture, through a military transition born from a country exhausted by terrorist violence, political failure, and the feeling that its leaders had stopped protecting it. He was a captain turned president, and a man who carried weapons in the field and then found himself responsible for an entire nation still burning at its edges. What distinguished Traoré immediately was not just his age or his ideology, it was his methodology. He did not govern through performance. He governed through precision. He asked questions that his predecessors never asked. He opened files that his predecessors never opened. He established a culture inside his administration that was deeply uncomfortable for anyone who had relied on ambiguity to survive, because ambiguity was exactly what he refused to tolerate. He reorganized Burkina Faso's security partnerships. He reviewed contracts. He examined who was entering the country, under what terms, and on whose invitation. He built relationships with other African leaders who shared his analysis, that the continent's crisis was not simply one of terrorism or poverty, but of penetration. Decades of foreign interests and internal collaborators working together to extract resources, neutralize sovereignty, and keep African governments permanently dependent. It was during this period of systematic review that the Ugandan general entered the frame. The connection did not begin with a confrontation. It began with a pattern, a series of transactions, movements, and communications that appeared in multiple separate investigations Traoré's team was running simultaneously. Cross-referencing those investigations produced a name. That name produced a network. And that network, when followed all the way to its edges, then produced evidence of something far larger than one corrupt officer's personal enrichment. What Traoré's investigators found was a structured operation. The general had been serving as a regional broker, connecting military officials across multiple African countries to external parties interested in gaining access, influence, and in some cases, physical control over strategic locations and resources. He was not simply taking bribes, he was facilitating a system in which African military infrastructure was being quietly leveraged by foreign interests in exchange for payments that never passed through official channels and therefore never triggered official scrutiny. Some of the operations connected back to resource sites in the Sahel, the exact region where Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had been fighting for their survival against armed groups that somehow always seemed better equipped, better informed, and more strategically positioned than local military analyses could easily explain. When Traoré's team laid out the full picture of what they had assembled, the room went quiet, because this was not just evidence of corruption, this was evidence of coordination. And coordination implied that some of the military insecurity those countries had been experiencing was not entirely organic, that someone, somewhere, had an interest in maintaining instability and had been paying people inside the system to make sure that instability continued. Now pause here for a moment, because this is where the story becomes more than one general, more than one country, more than one scandal. Think about what it means if a foreign actor is deliberately funding instability in the Sahel through compromised military intermediaries. Think about how many policy decisions, military deployments, humanitarian responses, and diplomatic negotiations were built on the assumption that the violence in that region was simply ideological, driven purely by extremist groups operating independently. If that assumption was wrong, if part of the infrastructure of insecurity was deliberately constructed and maintained, then everything built on top of that assumption was also wrong. That is the depth of what Traoré was now holding. The question was not whether to act. For Traoré, there was never really a question about that. The question was how to act in a way that was proportionate, strategically sound, and impossible to dismiss, deflect, or reframe by the people whose interests it would threaten. Because he understood with complete clarity then that the moment he moved against this network, the network would move against him. That was not paranoia. That was the demonstrated pattern of every African leader who had ever tried to expose what lived underneath the continent's political surface. He had to be surgical. He had to be documented. He had to be right. His team spent weeks preparing. Every piece of evidence was verified through multiple independent sources. Financial records were traced through intermediary accounts to their origins. Communications were authenticated. Testimonies from individuals inside the network who had decided, for their own reasons, that cooperation was now safer than continued participation was secured and cross-referenced. By the time Traoré gave the order to proceed, the case was not just strong, it was airtight. The meeting with the general was arranged through back channels, framed as a bilateral security discussion between Burkina Faso and Uganda. The general accepted because accepting was routine, because for his entire career, these conversations had been the mechanism through which arrangements were quietly made and quietly extended. He had no reason to believe this one would be different. He arrived in Ouagadougou with confidence. He left without it. The details of what was said inside that room have never been fully disclosed, and perhaps they never will be. But the outcome was documented, and the outcome was decisive. Traoré's team presented the general with what they had assembled, not as an accusation in the conventional sense, but as a complete accounting. Every transaction, every communication, every intermediary, every site. The general sat with it and understood in real time that the life he had constructed around strategic invisibility had been made completely visible. He had two choices: deny everything and face formal international exposure of evidence that would be impossible to refute, or cooperate, provide the remaining names, the structures, the contact points, the timelines, and allow Traoré's team to complete the picture he needed. The general cooperated. And here is where Traoré's intelligence becomes fully visible, because he did not treat this moment as a trophy. He treated it as a tool. The goal was never to humiliate one man or score a symbolic victory. The goal was to dismantle the structure that man had been serving. Yet publicizing the confrontation would have produced a news cycle. Using what came out of it produced operational intelligence that could actually change conditions on the ground. What the general provided confirmed and expanded what Traoré's team had already assembled. Specific foreign entities, specific channels through which payments moved, specific individuals inside multiple African militaries who had been part of the arrangement, specific timelines showing when certain destabilizing activities intensified and how those intensifications correlated with external events, elections, contract negotiations, and resource discoveries. The picture that emerged was not comfortable. It implicated people who held titles, gave speeches, attended summits, and shook hands with leaders from around the world while simultaneously funding the conditions that kept those leaders unable to govern effectively. It was the kind of picture that, once seen clearly, makes you reconsider everything you thought you understood about why African countries struggle the way they do, and who benefits from that struggle continuing. Traore shared the intelligence he gathered with select counterparts, leaders in the alliance of Sahel states, specifically Mali and Niger, who had been his partners in breaking from the inherited model of dependency and building something new. He did not broadcast it publicly in ways that could be challenged, dismissed, or turned into a geopolitical spectacle. He used it operationally to identify threats, close vulnerabilities, and build a security architecture that was informed by reality rather than the managed fictions that had been passed to previous governments as intelligence. Within months of the operation, multiple security arrangements were restructured. Certain individuals in regional military networks were quietly removed from positions where they had access to sensitive operational information. Certain financial flows were interrupted, certain access points were closed. The violence in parts of Burkina Faso did not end overnight. No one with a clear understanding of the situation ever claimed it would. But the texture of the security environment shifted. Operations that had previously failed began succeeding. Information that had previously leaked began holding. The men fighting on the front lines, who had spent years feeling like they were working against a resistance they could not fully see, began to feel something different. Not victory yet, but clarity. The clarity that comes when you finally understand the shape of the problem you are actually solving. What makes Traoré's handling of this entire situation remarkable is not any single decision. It is the consistency of the approach across every decision. He never allowed the process to become personal. He never used it for theatrical domestic politics. He never extracted from it more than it could honestly deliver. He remained, throughout, exactly what he had been from the beginning, a man trying to solve a real problem with the tools actually available to him, and refusing to pretend that symbolic gestures were the same thing as structural change. Let me ask you something directly. When you look at Africa's history over the last 60 years, the coups, the debts, the conflicts, the humanitarian crises, the leaders who started with genuine vision and ended in compromise or violence, how much of that history looks different if you account for the possibility that some of it was engineered, that some of the dysfunction was not the natural result of weak institutions or cultural factors or bad luck, but was deliberately cultivated by people who understood that a permanently struggling Africa was more profitable to them than a self-sufficient one? That question is not comfortable. It is not meant to be. But it is exactly the question that Traoré has been willing to hold in public. Not as a conspiracy, but as a structural analysis backed by documented evidence. And the Ugandan general incident is one piece of that evidence, one node in a network that, when mapped fully, tells a story about power that challenges almost every official explanation that has ever been offered for why the Sahel has burned the way it has. There is a reason why certain international commentators responded to Traoré's emergence with immediate skepticism, not the measured skepticism that serious analysis requires, but the reflexive, preemptive dismissal that powerful interests deploy when someone threatens to make the hidden visible. He was called young, he was called inexperienced, he was called dangerous. But these characterizations came before any evidence was evaluated, because evaluation was never the point. The point was containment, putting a frame around him that made his analysis look unstable before anyone had to seriously engage with its contents. It did not work, because the contents could not be dismissed by people who understood what they were actually looking at. Traoré continued to govern, he continued to build alliances with leaders who shared his framework. He continued to systematically dismantle the mechanisms through which external interests had historically exercised control over Burkina Faso's decisions, from security partnerships to economic agreements to the media environment inside the country. Each step was methodical, each step was documented, each step made the next step more secure. The Ugandan general Aten, for his part, returned to a life significantly diminished from the one he had enjoyed before that meeting in Ouagadougou. The networks that had given him power and protection had been partially exposed, and exposed networks are worth considerably less than hidden ones. The people he had served had less use for a broker whose value depended on invisibility. He did not face the kind of public trial that produces dramatic footage, but he faced something that, for someone whose power had always lived in shadow, was in many ways worse. Irrelevance, erasure, the withdrawal of the very obscurity that had been his greatest asset. There is a final dimension of this story that deserves direct attention because it is easy to overlook in the drama of the confrontation itself, and that is the question of what it costs to do what Traore did. Yet every leader who has ever tried to expose the infrastructure of hidden power in Africa has paid a price. Some paid it in isolation, cut off from the international support systems their countries needed to function. Some paid it in internal instability, because disrupting networks of corruption also disrupts the fragile equilibria that keep complex societies from fracturing. Some paid it in their lives. The history of the continent includes too many names of men who saw clearly, acted accordingly, and were removed before they could consolidate what they had started. Traore knows this history. He has spoken of it directly and without romantic embellishment. He does not pretend that what he is doing is safe. He does not present himself as invulnerable. What he presents, consistently and clearly, is the argument that the alternative, continuing to manage decline, continuing to operate within systems designed to produce failure, is simply not acceptable. That the cost of challenging the structure, even at personal risk, is lower than the cost of leaving it intact. That is not bravado. That is arithmetic. And for millions of people in Burkina Faso and across the Sahel and across a continent watching carefully to see whether this moment is different from the moments that came before, that arithmetic matters more than any credential, any endorsement, or any assessment offered by institutions that have a stake in the current arrangement continuing. Ibrahim Traoré did not expose the Ugandan general to make headlines. He exposed him to dismantle a mechanism, but yet he did not use the exposure to build a personality cult around himself as a crusader. He used it to build a security architecture that was more honest about the threats it was actually facing. He did not perform transparency, he practiced it, in the difficult, unglamorous, operationally specific way that actually changes outcomes rather than just changing narratives. What happened in that meeting room in Ouagadougou was, on its surface, one leader confronting one corrupt general from a neighboring country. But underneath that surface, it was a demonstration of something the continent has needed to see, that it is possible to govern without being captured, that it is possible to be young and strategic and morally serious at the same time, that it is possible to face down a network built over decades and force it to reveal itself. Thus not through force alone, but through the superior power of a leader who has done his homework and refuses to be moved. The general walked in untouchable. He walked out exposed. And the system he served, the one that had operated in the dark for 30 years, collecting payments, managing outcomes, and betting that no African leader would ever have both the knowledge and the courage to challenge it, learned something it had not expected to learn. It learned that Ibrahim Traoré was paying attention, and that for the people it had spent decades exploiting was the beginning of something different.